You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 192. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Sarah, learning leaders get things wrong.
And it's hard. Learning leaders also make mistakes.
And that's hard. They embrace vulnerability as courageous leadership.
And that's hard too. And then there's the uncertainty and emotional exposure you feel as a leader, and you step into it anyway.
And that's hard. And when you recognize that's your call to courage,
it's still hard.
And you do it anyway.
So before going any further, let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast, and you are looking for episode 192. Let's say what we just said in a different way, Tim.
When we're seeking to get things right instead of being right, we're going to have hard conversations. Some will be awkward and uncomfortable. But if you're leading from a growth mindset, if we're approaching it as a learning leader, we can also be courageous enough to skill up for the hard conversations.
So let me remind you, in episode 190 and 191, we talked about getting curious, asking questions, and asking for help alongside being challenged to grow as a learning leader. In episode 189, we talked about the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So today we're going to build on all of that and explore how learning leaders are courageous when they lean into vulnerability and skill up for hard conversations. So can I start with an unpopular opinion?
Sure. Can I stop you?
Probably not. Unless you want to hit the mute button. Oh, wait, I have control of that, don't I?
Well, it would be hard to stop you, so go ahead.
Doing something the hard way can benefit you. That's the unpopular opinion. Taking the stairs versus hopping on the elevator. The stairs are the hard way. Can we all agree on that? They're also the healthier way. So when we talk about doing hard things, we're talking calculus, passing your organic chemistry final exam, giving birth, finding the house in the current housing market, sitting with someone who is in their last moments of life. Hard. You've experienced one of those, I'm sure.
So when we avoid hard things, sometimes we're really avoiding being uncomfortable or avoiding potential conflict.
Yeah, and can we just pause there for a second? Because our human mind is always way more creative with what could happen in terms of what we're avoiding than what actually ends up happening.
So one of the things we've talked about in the past is the stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And other things, of course, that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but because being a courageous leader or being the leader that has to take on hard things, sometimes it's conversations about race or gender or class. Sometimes it could be, as I'm going to say, as simple as we've got some repairs to do on the church building, and it can be as hard as some things aren't getting done. What do we need to do to get them done? And whether that's involving relationships or ministry opportunity, those are all hard conversations. Let me give you an example of something that reminded me of how difficult things are, how hard things can be. I just read a story recently about Ruby Bridges was 6 years old when she was led into an all-white elementary school in New Orleans. And the sidewalk was lined with people who, with white people who were chanting 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. And as soon as Ruby entered the building, the parents went into the building and remove their children. Those were tough times. But let me tell you that little 6-year-old Ruby one day was seen saying something to the crowd. And this is what I remember about it. And that is, she was saying something to the crowd, and she was asked later what she was saying. And she said, "I'm praying for them." And Ruby, "Why would you be praying for them?" "Well, that's what my mom and dad taught me to do." "Well, what were you praying?" And she said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And for a whole year, she was led into the school building by federal marshals with people lining the sidewalk calling her names, and with images of, it was a doll, but as a black child in a casket. She said she had nightmares after that. But she did some really hard things that have brought us to a place today where we're really, as tough as it is for us today, we're in a better place because of Ruby Bridges. She leads seminars and things now about making tough decisions around race and gender. That's just what came to mind, Sarah.
So here are 4 reminders about doing hard things as a learning leader. And we're going to walk through each of these 4 reminders. The first one is there are skills that we can learn to have hard conversations. I can only imagine, Tim, the example that you just gave being Ruby Bridges' parents and the hard conversations that they needed to have with their daughter, and they did have with their daughter, and how they modeled that in such a faithful way. I mean, I can only imagine that. And we don't have enough time or space to teach you the skills here, but if you want to jump back to episodes 55 through 59, we do talk there about rumbling with vulnerability and having tough conversations. And I think there are even a few handouts that download type things that you can grab if you're feeling ill-equipped to engage in hard conversations. Again, it can be anything. We've given you some examples, but hard conversations happen all the time when we're dealing with people. And most of us don't have the skills to have those hard conversations. So that's why we did those podcasts way back in episode 50 to 59.
So it's as simple as a learning leader, learn. It's no one else's responsibility to teach you. It's not people of color's responsibility to teach you about their culture, to make you feel comfortable. History's history. It's going to be uncomfortable at points, so accept the discomfort as a normal part of being an adult and being human. A learning leader learns.
So what's the second point, Tim?
Second, when it comes to doing hard things, often those hard things involve needing to talk with other people. So here's the reminder: talk to people and not about them.
Yeah, and especially as Christ-centered leaders, I would encourage you to live into your values and the values of the organization that you represent. And if you say you love God and love people, you're not going to talk about them. You're going to start having a conversation with them. Will you make mistakes in that conversation? Probably. Will it always be easy? No. But you're a learning leader. And if you want a bonus tip here, I'll give you one. Begin with questions that level the playing field. So if it is a hard conversation, here's a good question that you might ask. I'm putting this in the context of a work-type relationship. Given what happened on the last project, how can I best support you in being successful? Tim, what's your go-to question that you always ask people?
My go-to question, as we mentioned last episode, is, what do you need from me, and how can I help you? How can I help you do what you need to do to be who God created you to be?
Now listen to that question, or the one that I offered, and contrast it with this question. This would be a not so great question. Okay, I'll call it a bad question. What do you think we need to talk about in regards to your performance at X event? Why it's a bad question is what happens with that question. You immediately put somebody on the defense. The question that Tim asked, the question that I posed, invites people into a conversation where they feel supported. And so it might still be a hard conversation, but you're actually leveling the playing field.
Yeah, Sarah, with the question you said that was a bad question, what I feel in that isn't being defensive totally, but is the idea that you're actually backing somebody in a corner because they're going to say, I'm not sure you know what you're talking. You're being manipulated. And so whatever you say, you're not allowing the person to come out at a place where they feel comfortable about anything.
Right. And that's
and that's not what we're about.
Right.
Go ahead.
There's nothing courageous about that question. What is the third point?
Well, Sarah, thirdly, we be kind, be clear, be honest. I think one of the things that we want to say is kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive.
And how I say this is you don't have to be a donkey, to put it in biblical terms, to be honest with someone about what's happening. Your clarity and your kindness will go a long way in having that hard conversation. So if you're not clear stepping into the conversation, get clear before you have it. Don't use that as an excuse not to have the conversation, but take the time to get clear on how you can communicate it with love and caring kindness.
So, Sarah, one of the things that I'm thinking about, which I don't think this is entirely about being clear, kind, and honest, but I really have difficulty, and I've got to say, if somebody leads with this, I'm immediately on the defensive, and that is, I want to speak to you, I want to talk about truth in love. That there's nothing clear, and there's nothing kind, and there's nothing honest about that from my experience. What you're doing is leading with something to be able to say what you want to say and telling me that you love me. And that I've been cut off at the knees more than I want to with somebody leading that way. I don't see that as being the kind of leadership that we're talking about.
So I would say that that's an example of not being honest or kind or clear. Yes, it's using and there are, I'm sure, other examples of phrases that get used to either manipulate or make our point. Maybe here's an example of this in terms of a hard conversation where you are clear, you're kind, and you're honest. I'm going to give you the negative example first. When you ignore or tolerate performance behaviors, let's say, I'm going to put this in a church context. I'm making these things up. The musician is always late for rehearsal. The administrator constantly misses deadlines. The pastor isn't responding to the requests from meetings. You're tapping out instead of diving into the hard conversations. So in any of those situations, you're communicating to everyone else on the team in the congregation that what you're witnessing is okay. You really want to cause chaos and confusion? Make the behaviors okay for one person and not okay for another person. It's okay for the beloved musician to be late, but it's not okay for the newly hired admin. Now you're really getting into trouble. In any of those examples, if you see that something is happening or there is a pattern in the behavior, again, we're talking about work performance here, ask someone to have a conversation and simply say, here's what I'm noticing. Can you help me understand what's going on? It might be that your musician is rushing from trying to drop their child off at their in-laws to be cared for while they come to the rehearsal at a time of day that it's bumper to bumper traffic and they're doing the best that they can. And what really needs to happen is the rehearsal needs to be pushed back by 30 minutes so that they can be there on time. You see how simple it can be if you simply stop and are clear and kind and honest about it We don't want this to continue. What can we do? It can be solved easily. Your admin is missing deadlines constantly. What do we need to do so that we can keep the deadlines in front of you? Well, I don't find out about the deadlines until the day before it's due. Oh, we need to plan farther in advance. And then communicate those deadlines. It's not the admin's fault at all. You get my point.
Well, you've done well. It's almost like you've been reading the minutes of a church administrative board.
I may be making it up, but
part of what you're talking about, Sarah, and my thinking is that out of that relationship, you're still coming alongside of whether it's the musician, the new admin, or even a colleague, and you're being able to say, how can I help you? What needs to happen here? And it's not putting somebody on the spot or backing them into a corner. It's you're actually, out of care and compassion, walking alongside somebody so they can be who they were created to be.
Yeah,
that's really leadership.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on previous episodes of asking yourself, what's the most generous interpretation that I can offer here? And even in moments of frustration, when I pause and ask myself that question, that puts me as a leader in a different mindset and frame of mind to be able to have the conversation that is clear, that is kind, and that is honest. And I think that as you build those relationships, there begins to be give and take in the relationship so that the feedback that comes is expected. So that all that needs to be said is, Sarah, you really need to be on time for the meetings. That's all that needs to be said. And then I might say, I'll be happy to be on time. Now I'm making up having kids. If someone can help me get my kids to my in-laws, now I'm making up being married. And you get my point.
Well, if we're in this together, and that's really what it is. So it really depends on whether we look at things in a vocational way or whether it's employment, and to be the kind of leader we're talking about that has to have hard conversations, that has to make hard decisions. You actually are working with people who help you get things done, and you're also working with people who want to have things done, and you've got to find a way to be able to communicate in both places. So being a leader, and I think this is what we're talking about, is not easy. It is difficult. You have been given the gifts and the strengths and the abilities to lead at any given point in time, but it doesn't happen because you get up in the morning. It happens because you continue to work at developing relationships, learning new skills, asking the questions you need to ask at the times you need to ask them. And really the best working relationships I've ever had are when I've developed the relationships. It's a two-way street. It was not, even though there was supervisor and somebody else involved, the relationship may have been that way in a formal, official kind of way, but the work was done as a team and doing the work together. And that's not easy. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because we have a podcast and say it needs to happen. It happens because we step into it and say, now what do I need to know to do this next step?
Right. It happens with intentionality. It happens over time. It happens as trust is built. All of the things that go into being a courageous leader.
I'll say this,
that
is friendships are extremely important. When I'm talking about relationship, I'm not talking about necessarily making it a friendship, because what I've learned is, and I've said this before, too often friendships come before the mission or the goal, because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings or we don't want to lose a friend. And that's tough as a leader too. It's not necessarily that that's what happens, It's that if we have those relationships, we've got some values as being Christian that we can live when we live with each other, when we disagree, when things aren't going the way they're supposed to. We can still have those tough conversations and still be friends. I'm speaking partly out of experience, and not because I did it well. I'm speaking part out of experience because I continue to learn.
Anything else that we need to offer for this episode?
When I see relationships, Sarah, I just think we're at the most important part of all the work that we do. It's not about, if we can't do it out of relationship with one another, which is really anchored in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ, where we can care for one another in the midst of disagreements, where we can have compassion for one another, whether we are doing the things that we said we would do, and there's got to be accountability. There's something wrong. I mean, good leadership is rooted in the love of God. And if it's not, I'm going to go as far as to say it's not good leadership. And that's hard.
Yeah. And being like Jesus is hard. We forgot that one. So here are your write it down, talk it out questions for this episode. 1, what do you need to learn to have hard conversations? 2, what are you learning about yourself as a leader? Especially as it relates to the hard conversations. So think about diversity, race, politics, money, theology. What are you learning about yourself as a leader in the midst of those conversations? That's the question. As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast. And you're looking for episode 192. To navigate directly to the episode, head to transformingmission.org/192. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.